It is said when you enter into the Sistine Chapel that it engulfs you because all of the rich and priceless history it has in its walls. It houses some of the world's greatest artwork and some of the world's greatest architectural work in the world. The Sistine Chapel is a masterpiece all in itself. I'm going to talk about the history of the chapel, why it was built, how it got its name, how it made a common man, Michelangelo, into one of the world's most famous artists of all time, and how the chapel is still used every day in everyday life today. The Vatican Museum says that the chapel was built because they needed a bigger place to house religious events or celebrations. It also needed a bigger place, or a place where the conclave, which is the college of cardinals, could go to deliberate to select a new pope. The plaza architect at the time was Giovanni di Dolci, and since he was the architect at the time, he was the one commissioned to build the chapel. He built it around 1473. The pope at the time was Pope Sixtus IV of the Della Rovere family. He was the pope from 1471 to 1484. He wanted the walls of the chapel to tell the story of Moses and Jesus. So he hired some of the greatest artists at the time, Bellini and Rosselli, are just two of the four that he hired to paint the walls of the the walls of the chapel. Well, natural shifting in the ground and just in the world and the building and the chapel settling caused the ceiling to crack, to have a ginormous crack in the ceiling. The Pope at the time that this happened was Pope Julius II. Charles Bullock's article said that Bramante was the plaza's architect at the time. So he talked Pope Julius II into commissioning Michelangelo to redo the ceiling. Michelangelo didn't want to paint the ceiling. He thought of himself more as a sculptor. He thought that he was coming to the chapel to make sculptures for the Pope's tomb. So after a couple months of back and forth, Michelangelo finally decided that he would paint the ceiling. In Giovanni Carreri's article, she said that it took Michelangelo from 1508 to 1512 to paint the ceiling. That's 4 years. The ceiling consists of 9 panels and 6 windows. Each panel is painted differently and is supposed to tell the story of Genesis, which is the first book in the Bible. On one panel there is the story of Noah, the creation of Eve, but the most famous panel would be the creation of Adam. That's where you have Jesus and you have Adam, and their fingers are trying to touch, but they never touch. That would be the most famous panel of the ceiling that Michelangelo done. Michelangelo built his own scaffolding to paint the ceiling. He wouldn't let no one in the chapel. The only people that was allowed in the chapel was him and his helpers. He would even let the Pope in to see the ceiling. They had to mix the paint and the plaster and all that stuff every day. They would carry it up the scaffolding. Some believe, or some say, that Michelangelo laid on his back and painted the ceiling on his back, and they said it could be funny because you could see the plaster or the paint on his face. But he didn't. He stood up to where he could see the ceiling. He was nose to the ceiling, and he would paint. The only light he had was the light from the day that would come through the windows, and at night he had candlelight. It forever messed up his eyesight from just standing nose to nose with the ceiling just painting. Michelangelo never saw the finished ceiling and the whole ceiling at once until they reopened the chapel. He saw it He saw his finished artwork along with the Pope and everyone else at the time. Michelangelo hated painting the ceiling. He even wrote poems to his friend Giovanni di Pistoia. He talked about how it was like a lonely gloom and a genie in a jar. He was just miserable painting the ceiling. 22 years later, they finally talked Michelangelo into coming back, and he painted the wall behind the altar, which is the second most famous thing he is known for. If not, the creation of Adam and the Last Judgment are the two most famous artworks. Well, the ceiling and the wall behind the altar are the two most famous artworks that Michelangelo is known for. It took him from 1536 to 1541 to paint the wall behind the altar. This is the wall behind the altar. This is Jesus, and he has one hand like this and one like this. The hand that's coming up in the air is said to signify him either casting mankind to hell or raising them up to heaven. Here is the Archangel Michael blowing the trumpets to signify the return or the coming of the Lord. This angel here holds the book, the book with all the names in it that can go to heaven. So if your name's in the book, you would just rise up and go to heaven. And here is you got to pay the toll man to carry the souls that didn't make it to heaven over to hell. This and the ceiling are some of the most famous artwork. This is what draws people to the chapel. So that helps draw attraction and people to come to want to see this wonderful artwork. The chapel sees around 25,000 people or visitors a day. That estimates to about 5 million people a year. That's the population of the country Norway. That's how many people come to see the chapel every year. There were so many people coming and going, the Vatican had to create its own HVAC system or have its own HVAC system specially made to house, because all of the sweat and the humidity from all those people was starting to cause the paint and the plaster to chip. So it had its own special HVAC system made. They also still use this to elect the new pope in the Papal Conclave. This is the building the College of Cardinals lock themselves into to select a new pope. The way that they do this is they have a chimney, and they let you know with smoke whether they've come. There has to be a 2/3 majority vote. If it's a black smoke, they have not reached the 2/3 majority vote they need to elect a new pope. If it's white smoke, they've reached the 2/3 majority vote they need to elect a new pope. Well, when the white smoke comes out and they elect the new pope, they take the pope into the room of tears. And in Anna Mitchell's article, she talks about how the room of tears, it houses the cassock, which is the gown that the pope dons, the new pope dons. That's his attire. That's the first place he signs his name as pope. The last pope would have been Pope Francis. And they put a red carpet down to where he can kneel and pray in that he's the new leader of the Catholic religion. The Sistine Chapel houses some of the world's greatest history. It made Michelangelo into one of the world's most famous artists, and it still gets used on everyday basis, from letting people see some of the world's most wonderful art to help selecting the leader of the oldest religion in the world. I would suggest if you had a chance that you go visit, if you ever had a chance that you wouldn't let it pass you by, that you would go visit the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel just isn't a chapel for religious purposes. It's a place to where people can go see some of the greatest artwork and architectural work of all in the world.